like it when people take advantage and use other people. That rubs me the wrong way, and I know many of you, hopefully all of you, feel the same way. And jumping some logical steps here, I therefore struggle with some of Jesus' teachings about continual forgiveness. If someone continues the same behavior patterns over and over again, do I still forgive them? How do we reconcile these two things? Aren't they just taking advantage of me or somebody I care about or somebody that God cares about? But see, one of Jesus' disciples, Peter, apparently seems to struggle with some of these same issues, same thoughts, because he asked Jesus, all right, okay, Jesus, I get that you want me to forgive people. I think I get forgiveness. But how many times do I need to forgive somebody? If they keep doing this stuff over and over again, do I keep forgiving them? How many times do I have to put up with this? You know, this is getting to be like Groundhog Day or maybe a Marvel movie where I'm going back in time over and over again. But let's dig in here and see what would Jesus have to say? What does Jesus have to say to some of these difficult issues? Well, we're in parables here, and so Jesus tells a parable in answer to Peter's question. So let's look. So we're in Matthew chapter 18, so this is our first full parable that we're looking at. Last week was really just an introduction. Today we're actually going to look at a parable. We're going to cover it this morning. We'll dig into it more on Wednesday night. So again, just a plug, join us on Wednesday night if one, you'd like to learn more about this particular parable, but two, more about understanding the parables in general. So Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Matthew chapter 18. And I'm going to read just straight through verses 21 through 35. It'll be up here on the screen. I am reading from the English Standard Version. Then Peter came up and said to Jesus, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. And this is the word of our Lord Jesus. Let's first, when dealing with the parables, and particularly with this one, let's first deal with the context of where Matthew places this particular parable. Now, what's going on in the chapter surrounding this? So what comes before this in chapter 18? Well, Jesus, if you look back, Jesus is teaching about humility. Okay? He's teaching about humility. He's also teaching about sin and the seriousness of sin. And then he's teaching about God's care for sinful people. He's also teaching about forgiveness. And he's also teaching about how we navigate all of those issues within the context of the church. So that's the context of where this comes. So as we work through this, we're going to see this all fits together. These aren't just a bunch of teachings just thrown out there, but there's I wouldn't say a sequence, but there is a way that these all fit together, and we need to hold these together. And all of those teachings about humility, sin, how we deal with sin, how we deal with forgiveness within the church, all of this, again, leads up to Peter asking the question in verse 21. All right, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? How often does this need to go on? How often do I need to continue to forgive a brother or sister who continues to do the same thing? That's a good question. See, does being a Christian, someone who readily forgives over and over again, who is a Jesus person, who is a person of Jesus' kingdom, mean that I am a doormat, a milquetoast, a wuss, or a pushover? Peter's question doesn't sound or seem as outrageous, as ridiculous when we just reword it just a little bit. See, I think Peter's beginning to understand the depth of forgiveness that Jesus is talking about, and he's struggling with it. All right, Jesus, so what does this forgiveness actually look like in real life when I get involved in things where I know people are going to continue to hurt me? Do I continue to forgive them over and over again? That leads then to Jesus' answer, his parable. And he says, well, no, you need to forgive more than 7 times. Forgive 7 times 7 or 70 times 7, depending on how you translate that. So let's look at this actual parable. How do we understand this parable? We've got the context now, but with all parables, don't get bogged down in the details. Don't get bogged down in the details. See, our modern problem is probably more often over-interpreting the parables and trying to find details and read into the details just things that aren't there. We overanalyze them. So verse 23, the kingdom of heaven is like. That's how Jesus starts it out. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like verses 24 through 35. The kingdom of heaven is like the entire parable. It's not just like the king. That's important. The kingdom of heaven is like the entire parable. The kingdom of heaven is not just like the king. We need to think in terms of the entire parable. Think about the parable that I told at the end of the last message and that we talked about on Wednesday night. The bigger picture than just, all right, who is this character? Who is that character? So big picture here. We're thinking forest here, not individual trees. So we can ask the question like, is God, we read this, is God the king? Who are the servants? Is God the king? Well, yeah, yes and no. It's not a perfect picture. You know, so we shouldn't read into this and say, well, God acts like the king in every way in this parable. It's a rough analogy. It's kind of like saying, that meat tastes like chicken. You know, chicken covers everything. Frog legs taste like chicken. What does it taste like? Well, it tastes like chicken. These are very rough sketches. So God is like the king in his graciousness and his mercy and his willingness to forgive. That's about it. So God forgives those who are in debt to him, period. We don't need to really analyze it a whole lot further than that. So as we worked our way through this, as we read it, let's just give a quick gist or a quick summary. I tend to think, and I subscribe, that there isn't necessarily one point from this parable. I think several. We're going to look at I think 3 things can kind of come out of this, and they're all need to be held together. All need to held together. So forgiveness and mercy are not suggestions for the kingdom, but a defining element of it. We'll reword that. Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom of grace, mercy, and forgiveness, both in terms of how God deals with his people and how God's people are to deal with each other. Both of those things are found in this parable. God's kingdom, Jesus' kingdom, is a kingdom of grace, mercy, and forgiveness. both how God deals with his people and how God's people are to deal with each other. And then in somewhat of a paradox, failure to show this same grace and mercy and forgiveness that God shows us results in judgment. So I think all three of those can be found in here. So failure to show others the same grace, mercy, and forgiveness that God shows us results in judgment. So remember for our point from last week, can those three things be found elsewhere in Jesus' teaching? Absolutely. It can be found in Matthew itself, the gospel itself. Look at the Sermon on the Mount in particular. Over and over again, you see all three of those themes there. We could also say that really this parable is a further elaboration on the golden rule, isn't it? The first servant wants to be treated the first servant treats another servant in a way that he doesn't want to be treated himself, right? Is that right? Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, treat others in the way that you would like to be treated. This is kind of a further elaboration of that. So what exactly is Jesus saying? What is he telling Peter? How many times do I need to put up with sin against me over and over again? How many times do I need to do that? Well, in one way, he's saying as many times as it takes. Keep forgiving. Keep forgiving. Keep forgiving. Keep opening yourself up. Again, we talked about God kind of being risky along those lines. He did that. We do that. But let's read this. Let's read this in terms of the whole chapter, because this is a really relevant question. I don't know how many times I've talked to some of you, many of you, about this very issue. I know I'm supposed to forgive, but the same thing keeps happening over and over. I forgive, but this person keeps hurting me. I forgive 450 times, but this person keeps doing the same thing. They keep stealing from me. They keep cheating on me. They keep lying. Do I keep forgiving over and over? How do I go about this? Well, let's look at that very question a little bit deeper. Again, we're going to hold this in tension with the other things that Jesus says in chapter 18. So let's look at these previous teachings of Jesus in this same chapter, because these are all lumped together. I think Matthew wants us to hold these all together, and it's going to shed light on how we handle these specific situations. So in the previous section, Matthew 15 through 20, chapter 18, 15 through 20, what is he talking about? Well, Jesus talks about if your brother sins against you, if a fellow Christian, in this case it'd be a fellow Jew, but we'll contemporize it. If a fellow Christian sins against you, you need to keep escalating the issue until it's resolved. Okay? So Jesus says that sin against each other, against fellow Christians, cannot continue with Jesus' following. So continue to escalate it as necessary. So if somebody sins against you, go to them personally. Talk to them about it. If that doesn't work, bring somebody else along. Then the both of you talk about it. If that doesn't work, bring somebody else along. Then all of you go to talk about it. If that doesn't work, then you bring the whole leaders of the church. See, you keep going up the ladder as need be to put an end to the sin that's happening. Get this worked out. So at the same time, though, we would ask, but aren't we supposed to continually forgive over and over and over again? I mean, isn't that what that parable is just about? So what's up? If I'm supposed to keep escalating this sin issue, but Jesus here just tells me to turn around and just forgive, what am I supposed to do? Well, let's back up even further then. Even earlier in the chapter, verses 7 through 9, this may be a familiar one to you, Jesus teaches his people, tells us, man, go to whatever extent necessary to get a hold of sin in your lives. Is your eye, is your hand, is your foot causing you to sin? Well, cut them off. Poke them out. Not literally, of course. But do whatever it takes. Sin is serious. It can't continue for the followers of Jesus. And as he talks about then in 10 through 14, no matter how many times we struggle and fail, no matter how many times sin pops up, we're here for each other. I'm here for you, you are here for me. Why? Well, one, we're all connected together in the body of Christ, but two, because God has always been there for us. He's there for our repeated failures, and we're going to be there for each other for each other's repeated failures. We're in this together. Okay? So no matter what happens, we're gonna make it through this together with grace, with mercy, and with great forgiveness. It's kind of like the Cleveland Browns. This is a playoff weekend for football, but last week, for 18 years, since 2002, the Cleveland Browns had not made the playoffs. An 18-year drought. Finally, in 2020, they made the playoffs. Those Browns fans hung, I can't really say through the thick and thin, because really for 18 years it's just been the thin. The Browns fans hung in there for ineptitude, struggle, and failure. I mean, I should have printed off a list of all the quarterbacks they've had over the past 18 years. The bitter pill for all Vikings fans to swallow is that the person that kind of headed it all up was Kevin Stefanski. So I'm sure I'm going to get some thumbs down and some angry faces from you in the chat for that. But we go through this together. We make it through this together as a body. But with that said, sin, even though we're hanging in there with each other, Jesus points out the seriousness of sin. Sin is not flippant. It's got to stop. And if your brothers or sisters aren't serious about that stopping, then bring it up the ladder. We escalate it as necessary. We take it it's just one-on-one, then it's 2, and then it's 3, and then it's the whole church that we address these issues. So, where am I going with this? Well, when we read then 15 through 20, I'm kind of all over chapter 18, but when we read this chapter, when we get to 15 through 20, if we read 15 through 20 about escalating sin, all right, I'm going to go to my brother and talk with him or her or sister about a sin against me, that I've got to go to him, got to talk to him, got to deal with it. If we read that without reading Jesus' parable that we just read about the unforgiving servant, we deal with each other with cold hearts, without empathy, without an openness and grace and understanding. We become judgmental, arrogant, and self-righteous. On the other hand, if we only read the parable and not what Jesus has talked about before, then we can be just living doormats to be walked all over, and we diminish the seriousness of sin. And like anything goes, it doesn't matter. We just forgive and forget. Off we go. But when we hold this entire chapter 18 together, the parable really begins to crystallize and to make sense. It's worthwhile to note that forgiveness that Jesus is talking about here, this is important, that forgiveness is not a license that things must continue as is. It is indeed entirely possible to forgive a brother and sister in Christ, as Jesus talks about in this parable, 490 times or whatever, while still practicing verses 15 through 20. I haven't read 15 through 20, but go back and read that. That's, again, the escalating the sin. It's entirely possible to do both. We can say, I forgive you from the bottom of my heart, and also at the same time say, we're not doing this again. We're not doing this anymore. I learned my lesson the first time, shame on you, next time shame on me. There's the opposite. No, that's right. We're not withholding forgiveness, but we can say we're not repeating this again. An example. So say your teenager comes to you and said, Dad, Mom, I need $50 for the school trip. Well, you give the kid $50, and come to find out your teenager skips the trip and uses $50 for whatever, for something that they shouldn't have used it for, without telling you of skipping the trip and blowing the cash. If my teenager comes to me and apologizes and asks for forgiveness, fine, done. No ifs, ands, or buts. I forgive you, period. But with that said, the teenager still may not receive another $50 for a while, or not be allowed on another school trip, or out of the house for a while. Like, I forgive you, but we're setting some parameters. Okay, that trust has to be rebuilt. So Jesus continues to offer forgiveness over and over again, while at the same time setting standards and boundaries on sin for his followers. See, we often mix up the two and think that forgiveness means that we have no standards or no boundaries whatsoever. Well, in context of chapter 18, that's not what Jesus means at all. So, in full terms here, we have to read Jesus' parable in light of the whole chapter, realizing that no matter how right or how righteous we are in the forgiveness, in the situation, that we continually offer forgiveness to other people because we know we have been on the other side. We are always on the other side with God. And Jesus reminds us with this parable that his kingdom is a kingdom of grace, mercy, humility, and forgiveness. And that's the beauty of this. Jesus is trying to get us through his parable to see both sides. We are both the forgiver and the forgiven, and we can never forget that. We are both servants in this. We are the unforgiving servant and the forgiving servant. We are the forgiven. We have been shown mercy. We are those who have refused to show mercy, and we are those who have received mercy. Humility, forgiveness, and mercy is what God's kingdom is all about. All of those are held in tension in not only this parable, but in the entire chapter 18. That's what this parable is all about. So I want to leave you, I'm going to try to do this every week as long as my brain continues to function, I can come up with them. I want to leave you with two parables this morning. I'll leave you two parables, because sometimes we hear these parables enough that we lose kind of their luster. And I'm going to leave you with two different ones. You think about these, and we'll talk about them on Wednesday nights. I'm going to leave you with these two parables. The first one is short. Well, they're both short, but the first one's short, and the second one's even shorter. All right, your parables. The kingdom of heaven is like the time I bought a John Deere toy combine for my son Alistair. He, in turn, took one of his other combine toys and gave it away to a neighbor boy who didn't have any toy combines. She who has an ear to hear, let her hear. Second parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a business owner who applied for a PPP loan and received it. One of his employees' aging mother was suffering from the effects of COVID-19 and was in the hospital. The employee asked the business owner for a week off and an advance on his paycheck to care for his mother's affairs and look after his father while his mother was in the hospital. The business owner was enraged and screamed at his employee, "We work for our money around here. There are no handouts." The local community caught wind of what had happened, boycotted the business owner, and ended up putting him out of business. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. Thank you for joining with me today as we've looked at this very first parable of the merciful king, or the unforgiving servant, or the two servants. Join us on Wednesday night as I'm going to ask you some further questions. We'll reflect on those two last parables that I shared with you as well. Go this morning knowing that Jesus' kingdom here on earth right now is a kingdom marked by great grace, mercy, humility, and forgiveness. Go this morning knowing God has shown that to you, and that you in turn can show that to others. Thank you for joining me this morning. Blessings.